So next slide. So flexion is, so here's flexing your elbow. Here's shoulder. You have flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Notice that flexion is this way, and extension, so is arm straight down, and hyperextension is the arm going back. Okay. Now, if you stand in the standard anatomical position, you are in a position of extension. So, standard anatomical position is a position of extension. So, let's see. Then we have hip. So we have flexion this way. So extension would be straight up and down, and then hyperextension would be going backwards. Then we have lateral flexion is D, so we go side to side. And then we have lateral flexion here of the trunk at the hips. Next slide. Here's abduction of the shoulders and hips. Abduction abduct means to take away. So like you've been kidnapped, so you've been abducted. So you take that part of your body away, that arm goes away from your body, that's abduction. You can also abduct the fingers and the toes, as you can see here. And then you can adduction means bring it back together. So you adduct by bringing you take the leg. If you take the leg away from your body, away from the other leg, that's adduction. Sorry, that's abduction, and then bring it back underneath you. That's adduction. So you can adduct the fingers and toes. Then there's also something called circumduction, and that's where you make a cone. So you make a cone shape with your arm. Okay, so she's going spinning around this way. That's circumduction. Next slide. So here's rotation. That's at the AO joint, or the Atlanto-Occipital joint. Here's internal rotation and external rotation. And notice that it's at the hip joint. It's not at the ankle. This is rotating up here. The rotation is occurring at the hip joint. Then we have internal and external rotation of the shoulder. So you externally rotate it and internally rotate it. And that's rotation at the shoulder joint. So technically it's abduction by you're taking the hand away from the body, and then if you bring it back, it's adducting. But since the motion is actually at the shoulder, then it's actually internal. It's actually rotation at the shoulder. So you're not. It's not adduction at the shoulder. It's actually rotation at the shoulder. So I know it can be a little confusing to look at that and say, well, it looks like adduction, abduction, but it's actually internal, external rotation because the movement is taking place at the shoulder. You have to identify the joint at which the movement is taking place. Next slide. So here's rotation versus circumduction. You have rotation of the shoulder here, so it basically just spins around on an axis. Circumduction, you make this cone shape like that. Is what circumduction looks like. Next slide. Let's see. Some special movements. There's opposition of the thumb and reposition of the thumb. Then you have depression of the mandible, elevation of the mandible, protraction of the mandible, so you stick your lower jaw out, and retract the mandible, so you bring it back. You have inversion of the foot. It means the sole of the foot is pointing towards the middle of your body. Then you have eversion of the foot, and eversion means the sole of the foot is pointing out away from the midline of your body. And if you're doing sort of sports therapy or sports medicine, you'll run into this quite a bit. They will talk about someone gets an ankle sprain, and was it an inversion ankle sprain or an eversion injury to the ankle? Then we also have dorsiflexion of the foot, and we also have plantarflexion of the foot. So dorsiflexion where you bring the toes back towards your shin, and plantarflexion where you point your toes. Next slide. Here's some other examples. You have supination of the forearm, so that's showing it in anatomical position. Then you have pronation of the forearm, so it's moving the palm so it's facing towards the posterior side of you. Next slide. Also, here's the other Atlanto-Occipital, AO joint, and cervical intervertebral joints. Here's what's happening. So we have flexion would be bringing your chin forward. Extension is when your head's up and looking straight ahead, and hyperextension if your head goes back. Next slide. Just pointing out, reminding you where the AO joint is. So the atlas here, and the atlas and the axis. Atlas. I need to write down. My brain starts going too fast. My mouth is behind, or one or the other. So we have the atlas and axis. And so this is where you can have rotation. You can also have flexion, extension, and hyperextension also. So flexion, extension, and hyperextension are going to occur mostly at the Atlanto-Occipital joint. So the atlas, Atlanto-Occipital joint, which is the atlas where it meets the condyles of the occipital bone. And the occipital bone is sometimes referred to as the occiput, if you ever see that word. So, and then then you have rotation at the axis, at the AA joint, the Atlanto-axial joint. Next slide. There's just a side view of the AO joint and the AA joint. Next slide. Shoulder joint. So we have flexion would be this way, would be flexion. Extension is number 5, and then hyperextension going backwards, number 4. Next slide. So this is flexion, and this is hyperextension. Oops. We have the elbow joint with flexion and extension. Elbow joint's also a hinge joint, so it can only do 2 things. It can extend and flex. Then you have flexion, extension, hyperextension at the wrist. These are all examples of different movement where movement that you see at different joints. Then at the hip joint, we have extension would be with the foot straight down, flexion would be the leg going forward, and the hyperextension leg going backwards. So that's hyperextension at the hip joint. Next slide. We have the knee joint. It's also a hinge joint, so it can only do flexion and extension, as opposed to the hip joint, which can do flexion, extension, hyperextension, as well as adduction and abduction. And it can do circumduction. And it might be able to do a little bit of rotation as well. So the hinge joint can only do 2 things, flex and extend. A ball and socket joint, like the hip joint, can do all kinds of different things. Next slide. So here's abduction and adduction. So this is abducting the arm, going up, and then bringing it back to the side of the body is adduction. And so that's using the sort of hinge motion. So you're adducting and abducting. If you're rotating, this particular motion there's not rotation. The other motion where you had the internal external rotation, where you brought your hand across the stomach and then brought it out to the midline, out away from the midline of your body, and rotated outwards. That gave you that was external internal rotation. Next slide. Circumduction, you're doing the cone shape there. So you're making a cone shape there. Next slide. Abduction and adduction, you can actually do it at the wrist. So take the wrist and move the fingers away from your body is abduction, and then bring back would be adduction. Circumduction, again at the shoulder joint, and abduction, adduction at the hip joint. Abduction, adduction with the fingers. So you can abduct the fingers and take them apart, and adduct to them and bring them back together. Next slide. And we can also do rotation at the AO joint, or the AA joint, the Atlanto-Occipital joint, using the DENS, the odontoid process. Here's lateral rotation or medial rotation, or often referred to, usually referred to in, if you're doing PT, you refer to it as external and internal rotation. So lateral would be external rotation, and medial rotation would be internal rotation. So if you're doing PT, then you'll be talking about internal and external rotations a lot. You'll probably be trying to pop people's joints back into place by sometimes an injury may be caused by an external internal rotation out of range of where the motion should be in the joint. Next slide. Elevation and depression. So elevate the jaw and depression of the jaw or the mandible, and that's the only bone that moves in the skull, other than the ear ossicles. Next slide. Protraction, retraction. So your jaw forwards, protract and retract it by bringing it back. That motion occurs at the temporomandibular joint, the TMJ joint. So that'd be the TMJ, or TM joint, I guess I should say. Next slide. Pronation, supination. So we saw those. And that occurs at the radial ulnar joint. Next slide. And inversion and eversion of the intertarsal joints. Intertarsal joint, sorry. Next slide. And dorsiflexion and plantarflexion. So dorsiflexion, flexing your foot up, toes coming up towards your knee, and plantarflexion, pointing your toes. Next slide.